A sudden storm can shatter an empire's destiny. Picture history not as a series of kings and battles, but as a story where the true main character is the weather itself, a silent force capable of toppling thrones and saving nations with a single gust of wind or a freak bank of fog. By the end of this journey, you will know 25 specific moments where a twist in the forecast irrevocably changed our world. We will see how a divine wind saved an island nation and how a simple fog bank rescued a revolution in its earliest hours. What is the most powerful force in human history? The year was 1274, and the greatest naval force ever assembled was bearing down on the shores of Japan. Kublai Khan, the formidable Mongol emperor, had set his sights on the island nation, commanding a fleet of nearly 900 ships carrying thousands of seasoned warriors. This was not just an invasion, it was an overwhelming tide of military might, and the samurai defending the coastline were brutally outmatched. After a series of fierce but losing battles on the beaches, the Japanese defenders were pushed to the brink, their defeat seeming all but certain. Then the weather spoke. A violent typhoon, a churning monster of wind and wave, suddenly descended upon the Mongol fleet. Ships that had been instruments of conquest were smashed against the rocks or swallowed by the sea. The invasion was forced into a chaotic, desperate retreat. Japan was saved, but only for a time. Kublai Khan was a man not used to defiance, least of all from the weather. For 7 years, he prepared his vengeance, building an even more colossal armada. Historical accounts suggest a fleet of over 4,000 ships, a number that would not be rivaled for centuries. This was no mere fleet, it was a floating city of soldiers, a force designed to crush Japan through sheer, unstoppable mass. In the summer of 1281, this vast armada arrived, its soldiers beginning their assault. For weeks, the outnumbered samurai fought a desperate, holding action. They could not win a war of attrition against such a host. The situation was again dire, and the hope of victory was fading with each passing day. Then the divine wind returned. This was no ordinary storm, it was a cataclysm. The kamikaze, as it would be forever remembered, unleashed its full fury upon the Mongol fleet. Colossal waves, driven by hurricane-force winds, lifted the massive invasion vessels and dashed them to splinters. Hundreds, then thousands of ships were torn apart and sent to the bottom of the ocean. Tens of thousands of soldiers, trapped in the holds of their sinking ships, drowned in the raging waters. In a matter of hours, the greatest navy in the world was utterly annihilated, not by human hands but by the elements. The psychological and cultural impact of this deliverance was profound and lasting. To the people of Japan, this was not a lucky break, it was a clear sign of divine favor. They believed their gods had personally intervened to protect their sacred islands from the foreign invader. This belief in their unique, divinely protected status became a cornerstone of Japanese identity, cementing a deep-seated cultural isolationism that would define the nation for the next 7 centuries. The closed country policy, the suspicion of foreign influence, the very sense of being a land set apart, all of this can be traced back to those 2 fateful storms. The weather did not just save a nation that day, it forged a national spirit, one that would remain largely sealed off from the world until the black ships of another age arrived to force it open. Nearly 7 centuries after the kamikaze saved Japan, a different kind of weather miracle was brewing across the Atlantic. The American Revolution, not even 2 months old after the Declaration of Independence, was on the verge of being extinguished. General George Washington and his Continental Army were cornered on the western tip of Long Island, their backs to the East River. Behind them lay the vast expanse of the British fleet. In front, over 20,000 disciplined British and Hessian troops were tightening their lines, preparing for a final, crushing blow. For Washington's raw and weary force of roughly 9,000, surrender or slaughter seemed the only possible outcomes. The dream of American independence was about to be strangled in its cradle. Then the air began to change. On the night of August 29th, a thick, peculiar fog started to form over the river. It was not a wispy mist, but a deep, heavy blanket that swallowed sound and sight. To the British sentries peering from their camps, the world simply vanished. For Washington, this was a gift from the heavens, a final, desperate chance. He gave the order for a silent, immediate evacuation. Every available boat, from rowboats to sloops, was quietly commandeered. Under the cover of this profound gray silence, the Continental Army began its escape. Men waded into the water, holding their muskets and powder high above their heads. They boarded boats that were so overloaded their gunwales dipped perilously close to the waterline. The oars were muffled with cloth, and the soldiers were under strict orders of absolute silence. The fog was so dense that a man could barely see the person in front of him, yet it clung perfectly to the American shoreline, creating a wall that hid the entire operation from the enemy just a few hundred yards away. For hours, this ghostly procession continued. As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the sky, a panic set in. The fog would surely lift, exposing the last of the army still waiting on the docks. But in a twist that defied all logic, the fog held. It did not dissipate gradually. It remained a stubborn shroud until the very last boat carrying General Washington himself pushed off from the shore. The moment his boat reached the safety of Manhattan, the fog lifted as suddenly as it had arrived, revealing to the stunned British an empty coastline. The trap had been sprung on nothing. This was not merely a lucky retreat. It was the salvation of the revolution itself. Had that specific, persistent fog not appeared on that exact night, Washington's army would have been annihilated. The war would have likely ended then and there, with the rebellion's greatest leader and its primary military force captured or destroyed. The fog over the East River did not just save an army. It saved an idea, giving a nascent nation the breath it needed to continue its fight for existence. Less than 4 decades after Washington's miraculous fog, another continent would witness a far more brutal demonstration of weather's power. Napoleon Bonaparte stood at the peak of his power, commanding an empire that stretched across Europe. In the summer of 1812, he assembled the largest army the world had ever seen, the Grande Armée, a colossal force of over 600,000 men from every corner of his empire. This was not just an army, it was a moving nation, a seemingly unstoppable force of professional soldiers, cavalry, and artillery. Their goal was to crush the Russian Empire and force Tsar Alexander I into submission. Confident of a quick, decisive victory, they marched eastward under the warm summer sun, expecting the campaign to be over in weeks. The vast Russian landscape, however, held a terrible secret, a weapon far more devastating than any cannon. The Russian strategy was one of calculated retreat and scorched earth. They drew Napoleon's magnificent army deeper and deeper into their territory, burning their own cities and crops to deny the invaders any supplies. By the time Napoleon reached and captured Moscow in September, he found a city largely abandoned and set ablaze, offering him no victory, no supplies, and no surrender. With winter approaching, he had no choice but to order a retreat. But the Russian winter that year did not merely arrive, it attacked with a ferocity that seemed almost personal. It came early and with unprecedented savagery. Temperatures plummeted to -30 degrees Celsius and far beyond. The same roads that had been dusty trails in summer were now ribbons of ice, and the open plains became a frozen hellscape swept by relentless blizzards. The Grande Armée, still dressed in its summer uniforms, began to disintegrate. Men and horses froze to death where they stood, their bodies becoming grim markers along the retreat route. Fingers and toes blackened with frostbite, falling away from limbs too numb to feel the loss. The supply lines were non-existent, and starvation drove soldiers to slaughter their own horses for meat, then later, in the depths of desperation, to unthinkable acts of survival. Discipline collapsed entirely. This was no longer a retreat, it was a rout, a chaotic, desperate scramble for survival where every man was for himself. The very elements had turned against them, and the mighty army was being systematically erased by the cold. Of the more than 600,000 men who had marched into Russia, fewer than 40,000 staggering, broken souls would eventually straggle back across the border. The rest were left behind, claimed by the cold, starvation, or Russian cavalry. This was more than a military defeat, it was the shattering of an invincible myth. The disaster in Russia broke the back of Napoleon's power, crippling his military strength and, more importantly, destroying his aura of inevitability. The nations of Europe, seeing his profound weakness, rose up against him in a new coalition. Within 2 years, he would be forced to abdicate and was exiled to the island of Elba. Though he would briefly return, his power was never the same. The map of Europe was redrawn in the aftermath, with new balances of power established at the Congress of Vienna that would dictate continental politics for a century. The Russian winter did not just defeat an army, it dismantled an empire and reset the course of European history, all without firing a single shot. While Napoleon's frozen army retreated west, another climate catastrophe was quietly germinating on the other side of the world, born not from winter's bite but from the soil itself. Decades of deep plowing and aggressive farming across the American Great Plains had stripped away the native grasses that held the earth together. This fragile land, known as the breadbasket of the nation, was a disaster waiting for a trigger. That trigger was a relentless drought that began in the early 1930s, a dry spell that would stretch on for nearly 10 years. The rain simply stopped falling, and the sun baked the topsoil into a fine, powdery dust. Without the deep roots of the prairie grass to anchor it, the earth began to die. Then the winds came. They scooped up millions of tons of that loose topsoil, creating colossal, moving mountains of dust known as black blizzards. These were not ordinary sandstorms. They were apocalyptic events that could roll across the land for hundreds of miles, turning day into an eerie, copper-colored night. The dust was so thick it seeped into everything, finding its way through sealed windows and doors, coating furniture, food, and the lungs of those who breathed it. Children wore dust masks to school, and families slept with wet cloths over their faces, desperately trying to filter air that was more earth than oxygen. Respiratory illnesses they called dust pneumonia became rampant, killing the very young and the elderly. On the worst days, the static electricity generated by the churning dust was so powerful that it shorted out car engines and made barbed wire fences hum with a terrifying, unnatural energy. The land was no longer capable of sustaining life. Crops failed completely and livestock suffocated or starved. With no income and no hope, hundreds of thousands of families made the agonizing decision to abandon their homes. They packed their few remaining belongings into rickety cars and trucks, becoming part of a mass exodus westward. These migrants, many from Oklahoma and Arkansas, were labeled Ockies, a term of derision that belied their desperation. Their journey along Route 66 was a trail of tears, a search for survival in a promised land called California, but the reality they found was often brutal. The sheer number of migrants overwhelmed the state, leading to intense competition for scarce, low-wage agricultural jobs. They lived in squalid labor camps, facing prejudice and hostility from Californians who saw them as a drain on resources. This forced migration, driven entirely by the weather and the dust, reshaped the demographic and cultural landscape of America. It exposed the profound vulnerability of the nation's agricultural heartland and spurred the federal government into action, leading to massive soil conservation programs and the creation of the Soil Conservation Service. The ordeal was immortalized in John Steinbeck's novel The Grapes of Wrath, which seared the image of the desperate, Dust Bowl refugee into the national consciousness. The weather did not just destroy farms, it displaced an entire population, altered the fabric of the American West, and forced a nation to confront the consequences of its own ambition. Just as the dust settled over the American plains, we can look back to a different kind of storm, one that shaped the very identity of a future empire. In the summer of 1588, the fate of England hung in the balance. King Philip II of Spain, a devout Catholic, had assembled a mighty fleet, the Spanish Armada, with a holy mission to invade England, depose the Protestant Queen Elizabeth I, and return the island to the Catholic faith. This was a religious war fought on the waves, a clash of faiths and empires. The Spanish fleet was a formidable sight, a floating fortress of 130 heavy galleons designed for close-quarters combat and boarding actions. Against them, the English navy was smaller and more nimble, its ships built for speed and maneuverability. Under commanders like Sir Francis Drake, the English did not seek a direct head-on confrontation. Instead, they harried the Spanish formation, using their superior long-range guns to snipe at the enemy from a distance, picking away at the edges of the great crescent-shaped fleet. They were like wolves worrying a giant, lumbering bear, unable to deliver a killing blow but preventing it from ever reaching the shore. The Spanish plan was to sail up the English Channel, link up with an army waiting in the Spanish Netherlands, and ferry those troops across for a land invasion. But the English harassment was relentless, and the crucial rendezvous never happened. Frustrated and damaged, the Spanish commander, the Duke of Medina Sidonia, made a fateful decision. He would abandon the invasion and instead sail home by going north, around the top of Scotland and down the wild western coast of Ireland. It was here that the weather took its decisive role. A series of powerful gales, which the English would forever after call the Protestant wind, descended upon the beleaguered Armada. These were not mere squalls, but a sustained, violent assault from the heavens. The storms scattered the tight Spanish formation, driving ships wildly off course. The heavy galleons, already battered from their fight with the English, were now at the mercy of the North Atlantic. One by one, they were driven onto the rocky, unforgiving coasts of Scotland and Ireland. Ships that had once been the pride of Spain were smashed into splinters against the cliffs. Thousands of Spanish sailors and soldiers, half drowned and starving, washed ashore only to be killed by local English authorities or to die of exposure. Of the 130 ships that had set out with such confidence, fewer than half would ever make it back to Spain. The victory was immediately seen as a miracle, a divine endorsement of the Protestant cause. In England, the defeat of the Armada was celebrated as a sign that God was on their side, solidifying the Protestant identity of the nation and securing the throne for Elizabeth. It marked the dawn of British naval supremacy, a dominance that would last for centuries and forge a global empire. The wind did not just sink ships, it shattered the ambitions of a superpower and cleared the way for a new queen of the seas. A century before the catastrophic potato famine, Ireland was already shattered by a different climate disaster. The winter of 1740 arrived with a malice that seemed almost biblical. It was known as the Great Frost, a cold so deep and persistent it felt like the sun had abandoned the island. For months, temperatures remained far below freezing, locking the land in an iron grip. Rivers and harbors turned to solid ice, halting all trade and travel. The ground froze to a depth of several feet, shattering the roots of winter grains and killing livestock by the tens of thousands. Sheep and cattle, the backbone of the rural economy, simply dropped dead in the fields, their frozen carcasses becoming grim monuments to the cold. Just as the frost finally began to relent in the late spring, a new horror arrived. The rains never came. The summer of 1740 brought not relief but a severe and unyielding drought. The ground, already weakened, baked hard under the sun. What few seeds might have sprouted withered and died in the parched soil. This 1-2 punch of extreme weather left absolutely nothing to eat. The result was a famine of staggering proportion. With no grain, no potatoes, and no livestock, people were reduced to eating grass, weeds, and even the bark from trees in a desperate bid to survive. Diseases like typhus and dysentery, fueled by mass malnutrition, swept through the weakened population. It is estimated that this famine, born entirely from the weather, killed roughly 20% of the entire Irish population. Entire villages were emptied, and the social fabric of the country was torn apart. The suffering was so immense it sparked widespread social unrest and food riots, as desperate people clashed with authorities who seemed incapable or unwilling to provide relief. This tragedy was a dark foreshadowing of the even greater famine that would strike a century later, proving that the weather held the power not just to change a single battle, but to erase a significant part of a nation itself. Nearly 5 centuries before the Great Frost gripped Ireland, another downpour was reshaping the destiny of France. On the eve of St. Crispin's Day in 1415, a weary English army found itself cornered near the village of Agincourt. King Henry V, his forces ravaged by disease and a long march, faced a French host that outnumbered his by as much as 5-1. The French nobility, confident and eager for glory, were already arguing over which English knights they would capture for ransom. For Henry and his men, the situation was beyond desperate. It was a prelude to annihilation. Then the skies opened. A torrential, cold autumn rain fell throughout the night, soaking the recently plowed fields of Picardy. By morning, the battlefield was not a field at all, but a vast, churning quagmire of thick, clinging mud. This single meteorological event would become the great equalizer. The English position was a narrow strip of land between 2 dense woods, forcing the French to attack on a constricted front. Henry placed his hope in his longbowmen, commoners armed with the mighty English longbow, a weapon capable of punching through armor at a terrifying range. The French plan, however, relied on a massive, direct cavalry charge by their heavily armored knights, a tactic that had dominated European warfare for centuries. But on that day, the mud rendered that tactic suicidal. As the French knights, clad in full plate armor that could weigh 60 pounds or more, began their advance, they immediately sank into the morass. The charge, meant to be a thunderous, overwhelming blow, slowed to a labored, exhausting trudge. Horses struggled to move, their powerful legs trapped in the deep mud, while the knights on foot found every step a monumental effort. They were not just walking, they were wading through a trap laid by the weather itself. This gave the English archers all the time they needed. From the flanks, they unleashed a storm of their own, a continuous hail of arrows that fell upon the struggling French like iron rain. The mud and the arrows worked in a brutal synergy. Knights who slipped and fell in the heavy mud, utterly exhausted, often could not get back up, drowning in the shallow muck under the weight of their own armor. The French lines compressed into a helpless, disorganized mass, perfect targets for the English men at arms who moved in with axes and swords to finish the gruesome work. It was not a battle, it was a slaughter. By the day's end, thousands of the French nobility lay dead in the mud, while English losses were remarkably light. The victory at Agincourt was so complete, so improbable, that it became the stuff of instant legend, immortalized by Shakespeare centuries later. It crippled the French military and political leadership for a generation, and secured Henry's claim to the French throne, profoundly altering the course of the long and bloody conflict known as the 100 Years' War. The rain did not just fall that night. It conspired with the English longbow to prove that the age of the invincible armored knight was over, and that the weather itself could crown a king. 5 years after Napoleon's frozen retreat, a different kind of winter descended upon the world, one born not from seasonal change but from a geological nightmare. On the island of Sumbawa in modern-day Indonesia, Mount Tambora exploded in April 1815 with a force that dwarfed the power of every cannon fired in the Napoleonic Wars combined. It was the most violent volcanic eruption in recorded human history, ejecting immense columns of ash and sulfur dioxide high into the stratosphere. This vast veil of particulates began to drift around the globe, acting as a sinister shield that filtered out the sun's warming rays. The planet was plunged into a meteorological deep freeze, and the following year, 1816, would be forever remembered as the year without a summer. The effects were as bizarre as they were devastating. In the midst of July, a month that should have been the warmest of the year, frosts blackened crops from the farmlands of New England to the vineyards of Switzerland. Snow fell in Quebec and New York in June. In Europe, unending cold rains and freak summer snowstorms ruined harvests and brought transportation to a standstill. The result was a catastrophic global famine. Grain prices skyrocketed and desperate, hungry crowds gathered in town squares from Britain to Germany, their protests over the lack of food and the exorbitant costs often turning into violent riots. The weather had broken the fundamental contract of agriculture that summer would follow spring, and the social order began to fray under the strain of universal hunger. This single year of weather-driven chaos triggered waves of mass migration. In New England, thousands of farmers, facing complete ruin after successive crop failures, abandoned their stony, frozen fields and set out for the more promising soils of the American Midwest. This exodus accelerated the settlement of states like Ohio and Indiana, fundamentally shifting the young nation's demographic center of gravity. Meanwhile, in Europe, the famine had a strange and lasting impact on transportation. With crops failing, there was no oats or hay to feed horses, leading to a mass die-off of the primary means of travel and haulage. This equine catastrophe spurred a German inventor named Karl Dries to create a new, human-powered machine to replace the horse. His running machine, the direct ancestor of the modern bicycle, was a direct and practical response to a crisis created by a volcano on the other side of the world. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of that gloomy summer, however, was forged not in a field or a workshop, but in a villa on the shores of Lake Geneva. A group of friends, including the poets Lord Byron and Percy Bysshe Shelley and a young Mary Godwin, were trapped indoors for days on end by the incessant cold rains. With the world outside a perpetual grey, Byron proposed a contest to pass the time, a challenge to see who could write the most terrifying ghost story. Inspired by the unnatural darkness and the philosophical discussions swirling around her, Mary conceived a tale of a scientist who dared to create life. The story she penned during that storm-bound holiday became Frankenstein, a novel born from a global weather catastrophe that continues to haunt our imagination to this day. A single volcanic eruption had not only reshaped global agriculture and migration, but it had also, quite literally, invented modern science fiction. That same bitter cold that reshaped Europe had its ancient equivalent along another great river, one that marked the very frontier of civilization itself. For centuries, the Rhine River served as the fortified border of the Roman Empire, a natural moat patrolled by legions and guarded by a string of watchtowers and forts known as the Limes Germanicus. This watery boundary was the empire's lifeblood, separating the ordered world of Rome from the vast, untamed wilderness they called Germania, a land teeming with tribes the Romans viewed as barbarians. The river was more than a geographic feature. It was a psychological and military barrier, a symbol of Roman power and control. But in the winter of 406 AD, that power was about to be circumvented by a force no legion could fight. An exceptionally severe and prolonged cold snap gripped the region, a freeze so deep and unrelenting that the mighty, flowing Rhine solidified from bank to bank. The river that had been an impassable barrier for generations became a broad, flat highway of solid ice. This was not a temporary sheet of ice that might crack under a man's weight. This was a thick, stable bridge, strong enough to support the movement of an entire people. And that is precisely what happened. On the last day of December in 406, a massive confederation of tribes, including the Vandals, the Suebi, and the Alans, saw their opportunity. They were not a small raiding party, but a migrating nation, complete with warriors, elders, women, children, and all their worldly possessions loaded onto wooden wagons. With the Roman frontier forces stretched thin by civil wars and rebellions elsewhere, there was no significant army to stop them. This vast human tide simply walked across the frozen Rhine, their wagons rumbling over the ice where Roman patrol boats should have been. They crossed not as stealthy invaders, but as a population on the move, and they brought their entire society with them into the heart of the Roman province of Gaul. The psychological impact of this event was catastrophic. The unbreachable had been breached. The natural wall that Rome had relied upon for centuries had been rendered useless by a simple drop in temperature. The crossing itself was just the beginning. Once inside the empire, these tribes found a wealthy but vulnerable land, and they began to pillage it at will. The Roman response was slow and disorganized, crippled by internal politics and a lack of military resources. The Vandals, in particular, would embark on an epic 20-year migration that would take them all the way through Gaul into Spain and across the Strait of Gibraltar to North Africa, where they would establish a powerful pirate kingdom that would later sack the city of Rome itself. The frozen Rhine did not just allow a one-time invasion. It unleashed a cascade of events that shattered the integrity of the Western Roman Empire. It demonstrated to every other tribe beyond the frontier that the empire was weak, that its borders were permeable. A wave of further migrations and invasions followed, each one chipping away at the empire's territory and tax base. Within 70 years, the last Roman emperor in the West would be deposed. The ice that formed that winter was more than frozen water. It was the catalyst that turned a slow decline into a terminal collapse, proving that even the greatest empires are vulnerable to a simple change in the weather. A sudden hurricane can rescue a city just as surely as a fog bank can save an army. In the autumn of 1779, the American Revolution's focus had shifted to the south, and the strategic port city of Savannah, Georgia, was firmly in British hands. A powerful Allied force arrived to take it back, combining the Continental Army with a formidable French fleet and over 5,000 troops fresh from their alliance. This was the most significant combined operation of the war, a hammer blow designed to shatter British control of the region. For days, the French and American engineers meticulously dug siege lines, moving closer and closer to the British defenses. They planned a massive, coordinated assault for the 9th of October, an attack that had every chance of success. The British garrison was outnumbered and staring at defeat. Then the sky began to churn. Just days before the planned attack, a monstrous hurricane roared in from the Atlantic. It was not a mere storm, but a full-fledged tropical cyclone that unleashed its fury directly upon the siege lines. Torrential, wind-driven rains fell for hours, turning the carefully dug trenches into collapsing, water-filled ditches. The Allies watched in horror as their earthworks dissolved into mudslides. But the rain's damage was even more critical. It soaked the soldiers' cartridge boxes, ruining thousands of pounds of precious gunpowder and rendering countless muskets useless. The camps were flooded, supplies were ruined, and the entire offensive operation was thrown into disarray. The hurricane's chaos forced a heartbreaking but necessary decision, a postponement of the assault. That delay was a gift to the British defenders. They used the borrowed time to frantically strengthen their fortifications, adding newer bodies, sharpened logs, and reinforcing their redoubts. They learned of the Allied plans from deserters who fled the storm-wrecked camps. When the French and American troops finally launched their attack on October 9th, they were charging into a trap that had been perfected during the storm-induced delay. The assault was a bloody disaster. The Allied soldiers, including the brave Haitian volunteers known as the Chasseurs Volontaires de Saint-Domingue, were cut down by concentrated musket and cannon fire. The attack collapsed in minutes, with nearly 1,000 Allied casualties compared to just a few dozen for the British. Savannah remained firmly under British control, and with it, their strategic foothold in the south was secured for another 2 years. The revolution in the south would drag on, costing countless more lives in battles like Camden and Guilford Courthouse. That single hurricane had not just postponed a battle, It had altered the entire trajectory of the Southern campaign, prolonging the war and forcing George Washington to wait years more for the final victory at Yorktown. The weather had chosen its side, and for the British in Savannah, it was a savior. The heat on the plains of Hattin in July 1187 was a weapon in itself. Saladin, the brilliant Muslim commander, had masterfully lured the combined Crusader army, led by King Guy of Jerusalem, into a waterless trap. The Crusaders, clad in heavy chainmail under the relentless sun, were dying of thirst, separated from the one thing that could save them, the fresh waters of the Sea of Galilee. Their desperate march across the arid plateau was a slow-motion agony. Then Saladin gave the order to set the dry brush ablaze. The wind, already blowing from the east, did the rest. It whipped the flames into an inferno and carried thick, choking clouds of smoke and dust directly into the faces of the Christian knights. This was not a random dust storm, it was a manufactured hell. The searing wind stung their eyes and filled their lungs with a burning, gritty haze. Visibility dropped to near zero, turning the organized columns into a disoriented, panicked mob. Their heavy armor, once their greatest protection, became an oven, baking them alive from the inside. Men and horses, already at the brink of dehydration from days without water, now suffocated in the superheated air. The Crusader army, once a formidable force, lost all cohesion and simply collapsed. They were surrounded and cut down or captured with ease. It was one of the most catastrophic defeats in Crusader history. The true prize, the city of Jerusalem itself, now lay utterly defenseless. Within months, Saladin marched triumphantly into the holy city, reclaiming it for Islam without the need for a prolonged siege. The dust and wind at Hattin did not just decide a single battle. They decided the fate of an entire kingdom and reshaped the map of the Holy Land for centuries to come. The wind that saved Britain from the Spanish Armada a century earlier now returned with a vengeance, as if to collect a debt. In December 1703, a nameless hurricane of unimaginable ferocity descended upon the British Isles and did not leave for an entire week. This was not a passing squall, but a sustained, screaming assault from the heavens. Hurricane-force winds, the kind that no one alive had ever witnessed, ripped across the countryside and churned the surrounding seas into a maelstrom. Whole forests were flattened in an instant. The iconic windmills that dotted the landscape were not just broken, they were blown apart, their sails and bricks scattered like straw. In London, lead sheeting was torn from the roof of Westminster Abbey, and hundreds of houses simply collapsed, burying families inside. Out at sea, the carnage was apocalyptic. The Royal Navy, the pride of the nation, lost 13 warships in a single night. One entire fleet was driven from its anchorage and utterly destroyed, with thousands of seasoned sailors drowning in the freezing, chaotic waters. The storm surge was so immense that it permanently altered coastlines. Across England and the Netherlands, the final death toll was staggering, estimated to be in the many thousands. This was more than a natural disaster. It was a national trauma that shook the very soul of a society built on maritime power and Protestant faith. In an age where every event was seen through a lens of divine providence, how could such a cataclysm be interpreted? Many sermons and pamphlets declared it to be God's wrath upon a sinful nation, a terrifying judgment for its moral failings. The storm became a central character in the literature of the day, most famously in Daniel Defoe's groundbreaking book, The Storm, a collection of eyewitness accounts that stands as one of the first works of modern journalism. The public's desperate need to understand this act of God had an unexpected consequence. It spurred the British government to undertake one of the first systematic attempts in history to quantify storm damage, gathering data from every parish to assess the financial and human cost. This marked a subtle but profound shift, a move from seeing weather as pure divine will to something that could and must be measured and understood by human hands. The snow at Valley Forge was a different kind of enemy, one that could not be outflanked or outfought. It fell in relentless, deepening layers throughout the winter of 1777, burying the makeshift log huts of the Continental Army in a frozen silence. This was not a dramatic, single-day blizzard but a prolonged siege of cold, a season of suffering where the very air seemed hostile. General Washington's men, already exhausted from a string of defeats, faced a trial far removed from the glory of battle. Their threadbare uniforms were no match for the biting wind, and their shoes, worn to nothing, left bloody footprints in the snow. Disease ran rampant through the cramped, damp huts. Typhoid, dysentery, and pneumonia were the true commanders of that camp, claiming nearly 2,000 lives through a slow, agonizing attrition. The dream of independence was freezing to death in the Pennsylvania woods. Yet within this crucible of misery, the weather enforced a terrible but necessary pause. There would be no grand campaigns, no maneuvering for position. The army was trapped not by the British but by the snow itself. This forced immobility created an unexpected opportunity, a blank slate for a complete transformation. Into this scene of despair arrived a portly, flamboyant, and fiercely disciplined Prussian officer named Baron Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben. He found not an army, but a collection of independent militias, each with its own commands and little concept of unified action. Von Steuben's genius was his practicality. He did not try to impose a complex European system all at once. Instead, he started with the absolute basics, writing a simplified drill manual on the spot and personally demonstrating how to march in step and handle a bayonet. He created a model company of 100 men, training them himself until their movements were automatic, and then had those men fan out to train the others. The deep snow became their training ground, the bitter cold their drill sergeant. Day after day, through the harshest conditions, this ragged band of farmers and tradesmen were forged into a single, cohesive unit. They learned to load and fire their muskets in synchronized volleys, to wheel into new formations on command, and to trust the soldiers standing next to them. The discipline instilled during that winter did more than just teach battlefield tactics. It built an unbreakable esprit de corps, a shared identity as professional soldiers in the Continental Army. When the snows finally melted in the spring of 1778, a new army marched out of Valley Forge. They were not the same disorganized force that had staggered into camp months before. They were a disciplined, confident, and highly trained fighting force, ready to meet the British on equal terms. Their very first test at the Battle of Monmouth that June proved the transformation was real, as they stood toe-to-toe with the finest infantry in the world and fought them to a standstill. The weather at Valley Forge had nearly broken them, but in its brutal, unforgiving way, it had also built the instrument of their ultimate victory. The snow did not just test their endurance, it refined them, turning a desperate hope into a professional army capable of winning a war. Even the greatest conqueror could not command the rain. After a decade of undefeated campaigns that stretched from Greece to the very edge of the known world, Alexander the Great led his battle-hardened army into the lush, mysterious lands of India. They had crushed empires and crossed deserts, believing themselves invincible. But in the Punjab region, they encountered a force that no phalanx could break and no cavalry could outflank: the monsoon. It began not as a storm, but as a permanent, drenching state of being. The skies did not merely open, they seemed to dissolve, unleashing a torrential downpour that continued for 70 days without respite. This was not the familiar rain of the Mediterranean. It was a ceaseless, vertical ocean that flooded the plains, turning roads into rivers and camps into sodden islands of misery. The Macedonian soldiers, accustomed to dry, predictable climates, watched in horror as their leather shields warped and rotted. Their bowstrings went slack, and their precious iron weapons began to coat with a thick, orange rust. The very tools of their conquest were dissolving in their hands. The constant damp bred disease, and men began to sicken with fevers and dysentery in the squalid, waterlogged camps. The unrelenting humidity and the eerie, perpetual twilight beneath the cloud cover wore down their spirits in a way no enemy army ever had. These were men who had faced down war elephants and chariots without flinching, but the psychological toll of the monsoon was far worse. They were fighting an enemy that had no face and no formation, an enemy against which their legendary discipline and courage were utterly useless. After years of marching ever eastward, this was the final breaking point. The army, pushed beyond all endurance, finally mutinied. They refused to go any further into a land where the sky itself seemed to be their adversary. Alexander, for all his legendary prowess, was powerless. He could not persuade or threaten his men to continue. The mutiny at the Hyphasis River was not a rejection of his leadership, but a surrender to a force greater than any king. It was the monsoon, more than any human enemy, that finally halted the westward march of Hellenistic culture and turned Alexander's empire back. His dream of reaching the ends of the earth was washed away by a rain that would not end, proving that nature could impose a boundary where no army could. The most important weather forecast in human history landed on the desk of General Dwight D. Eisenhower in the first days of June 1944. The fate of the free world rested on his decision. For 2 years, the Allies had planned Operation Overlord, the massive cross-channel invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe. Every piece of that intricate plan, from the movement of thousands of ships to the timing of the airborne drops, depended on a very specific set of conditions: a low tide at dawn, a calm sea, and clear skies for air support. The chosen date was June 5th, but as that day approached, a savage storm descended over the English Channel. The skies darkened, the winds howled, and the seas churned into a chaos of white-capped waves. It was the worst weather the region had seen in 20 years. From his headquarters, Eisenhower faced an impossible choice: launch into the storm and risk the entire invasion force being drowned or scattered before it even reached the beaches, or postpone the operation. A delay of weeks would mean losing the essential combination of moon and tide, pushing the invasion back to July, and risking the entire secret being discovered by German intelligence. With a heavy heart, he gave the order. The invasion was postponed by 24 hours. For the hundreds of thousands of young men waiting on ships and in camps, the tension became almost unbearable. Yet this single day of delay, this agonizing pause, would prove to be the greatest gift the weather could have given the Allies. While Allied meteorologists, led by a team that included a Scottish civilian and a Royal Navy captain, pored over a new and promising set of data, their German counterparts looked at the same raging storm and reached a very different conclusion. The German High Command, confident in their forecasting, believed the foul weather made an amphibious landing utterly impossible for the foreseeable future. They saw a solid wall of bad weather. The Allied team, however, spotted a tiny, crucial crack in that wall, a brief and fragile break in the storm, predicted to last just 36 hours, beginning in the early hours of June 6th. This was the window. It was not perfect. The seas would still be rough and the skies partly cloudy, but it was enough. Acting on this critical intelligence, Eisenhower made his final, irrevocable decision: okay, let us go. On the morning of June 6th, that forecast held true. The winds eased, the clouds broke just enough, and the greatest armada ever assembled began its journey across the channel. The element of surprise was total. The German commander in Normandy, the legendary Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, was so convinced no attack was coming that he had left his post to celebrate his wife's birthday in Germany. Many of the frontline German units were stood down, their officers absent. When the Allied paratroopers began dropping from the skies and the landing craft emerged from the mist, the German defense was caught completely off guard, disorganized and slow to react. Those first few hours of chaos on the beaches were the direct result of that 24-hour delay and the forecast that enabled it. Had the Allies invaded on June 5th as originally planned, they would have sailed directly into the heart of the storm, likely resulting in a catastrophic failure. Had they waited for perfect weather weeks later, the Germans would have been fully alert and waiting. That one day, forced by a storm and seized because of a superior weather prediction, gave the Allies the surprise they needed to establish a foothold in Europe. The weather did not just change a battle date, it secured the beachhead that would ultimately lead to the liberation of a continent. Deep in the jungles of Central America, the stone monuments of a lost civilization tell a story of sudden silence. The classic Maya of the 9th and 10th centuries were at their peak, masters of astronomy, architecture, and a vast network of city-states. Then, almost within a generation, their great ceremonial centers like Tikal and Palenque were abandoned to the vine. For decades, theories of this collapse pointed to warfare or overpopulation, but the true culprit appears to have been a far more patient and pervasive enemy, the rain itself, or rather the lack of it. The evidence is no longer just in the empty palaces, but locked in the very landscape. Scientists drilling into the sediments of ancient lake beds and analyzing the chemical layers in cave stalagmites have uncovered a terrifying climate record. These natural archives reveal not a single bad season, but a relentless multi-decade megadrought that gripped the region. This was not merely a dry spell, it was a profound, generations-long shift in the climate that fundamentally broke the Maya world. You have to picture a civilization utterly dependent on seasonal rains. Their intricate agricultural systems, their ingenious reservoirs and canals were all designed to capture and store the annual downpours. When those rains failed, year after year after year, the entire system began to unravel. The reservoirs, the lifeblood of the great cities, slowly evaporated, leaving behind cracked, dry basins. Crops withered in the fields, and the jungle, once a source of bounty, could not sustain the millions of people living in the urban centers. Famine became a constant, grim companion. This environmental stress amplified every other social fault line. Can you imagine the desperation as the water levels dropped and the food stores emptied? The ruling class, the kings and priests who claimed a direct connection to the gods of rain and fertility, saw their divine authority evaporate just like the water in their reservoirs. Their rituals and sacrifices meant to bring life-giving rain were met with only a burning, empty sky. Faith in the established order collapsed, leading to internal rebellions, civil strife, and the wholesale abandonment of the very cities that had been the centers of their power and identity. People did not just leave, they scattered, fleeing into the hinterlands in smaller, isolated groups. The great plazas fell silent, the towering pyramids were reclaimed by the jungle, and a civilization that had dazzled the ancient world fragmented into a memory. The weather did not just cause a temporary crisis, it systematically dismantled a complex society, proving that even the most advanced cultures are built on a foundation of stable climate, a foundation that can turn to dust when the rains refuse to fall. The slow, grinding pressure of a changing climate can topple societies just as surely as any invading army. For 5 long centuries, from the 1400s to the 1800s, a climatic phenomenon known as the Little Ice Age gripped the northern hemisphere in a persistent chill. This was not a single catastrophic storm, but a creeping, inescapable reality that lowered average temperatures by just enough to unravel the delicate balance of life. The growing seasons shortened dramatically, and unpredictable, often violent weather patterns became the new normal. Summers were cold and wet, and winters were brutally long. Across Europe, harvest after harvest failed under the grey, unyielding skies. The result was a continent perpetually on the brink of famine. Grain stores emptied, and the price of bread, the very staple of life, soared beyond the reach of ordinary people. Malnutrition became a constant, weakening populations and making them vulnerable to disease. In the Alps, glaciers began a relentless advance, swallowing entire farms and villages in their slow, icy march. The chill even reached the heart of empires. In England, the River Thames froze solid on multiple occasions, so thick and stable that it could support the weight of a city. Elaborate frost fairs sprang up on the ice with temporary shops, printing presses, and even ox roasts held in the very center of the frozen river, a bizarre carnival in the midst of a deep freeze. But this prolonged climatic stress did more than just freeze rivers and ruin crops. It fractured the social order itself. When people could not understand why their world was growing colder and hungrier, they looked for someone to blame. This pervasive fear and suffering created a fertile ground for scapegoating, leading to a tragic explosion of witch hunts. Thousands of people, mostly women, were accused of conspiring with dark forces to summon the bad weather and destroy the harvest. They were tortured and executed in a desperate, superstitious attempt to appease a seemingly angry nature. The cumulative hardship also eroded faith in the old regimes. In France, the endless cycle of famine and the skyrocketing cost of bread, exacerbated by the poor harvests of the Little Ice Age, fueled the seething resentment of the peasantry and the urban poor. When the Estates General were called in 1789, the populace was already pushed to its absolute limit by decades of climatic hardship. The weather had chilled the land and starved the people, creating the tinder that a single spark of political revolution would ignite. The same dust that choked the plains would soon bake under an even fiercer punishment. As the Great Depression ground on through the 1930s, the Dust Bowl had already turned the American heartland into a wasteland. Then, in the summer of 1936, the weather delivered its final, brutal blow. A heat wave of unimaginable intensity descended upon the Midwest and Great Plains, a searing dome of atmospheric pressure that pushed thermometers to readings never before recorded. In states like North Dakota and Kansas, temperatures soared to 120 degrees Fahrenheit and beyond for days and then weeks on end. The air itself felt like a furnace blast, and the parched earth offered no relief. This was not merely a hot summer, it was a climatic cataclysm that pushed human endurance to its absolute limit. Night brought little reprieve, as temperatures often stayed above 90 degrees, denying any chance for recovery. The human toll was horrific. In cities like Chicago and Detroit, where tenement buildings became death traps, the elderly and the very young were the most vulnerable. People collapsed in the streets from heat stroke, morgues overflowed, and newspapers published lists of the dead that grew longer with each passing day. Nationwide, it is estimated that more than 5,000 people lost their lives directly to the heat, with thousands more perishing from related causes. But the devastation did not stop there. The heat was the final killing stroke for what little agriculture had survived the dust storms. Remaining crops withered and died in the fields, literally cooked on the stalk. Livestock died by the hundreds of thousands, their bodies piling up in putrefying heaps. This one-two punch of drought and extreme heat created a humanitarian crisis of staggering proportions, a national emergency that demanded a national response. The sheer scale of the suffering finally galvanized the federal government into decisive, lasting action. The Soil Conservation Service, which had been created just a year earlier, was dramatically expanded, launching massive projects to teach farmers new techniques like contour plowing and crop rotation to prevent soil erosion. The government began an ambitious program of planting millions of trees as windbreaks across the plains. Most significantly, this disaster spurred the creation of enormous water management projects, including a series of dams and reservoirs under the New Deal that aimed to control flooding and provide reliable irrigation for the future. The weather of 1936 did not just break temperature records, it broke the political inertia surrounding the environmental collapse. It forced a fundamental rethinking of the nation's relationship with its land, transforming the American landscape through policy and engineering, and proving that even the most devastating weather could plant the seeds of profound and necessary change. 200 Persian ships were already gone, destroyed not by Greek spears but by the sea itself. Days before the fleets ever met at Salamis, a colossal storm had caught the mighty Persian armada off the coast of Magnesia, smashing their best vessels against the rocks. For King Xerxes, this was a mere delay, an annoyance. He still possessed well over 600 ships, a force that dwarfed the combined Greek navy. He watched from a golden throne on the shore as his fleet moved to block both ends of the Salamis Strait, confident he was about to witness the final, crushing blow to Greek resistance. The Greek commander, an Athenian named Themistocles, understood his people were cornered. Their entire strategy relied on a single, brilliant deception. He sent a trusted slave to Xerxes with a message pretending to be a traitor. The Greeks are in disarray and plan to slip away under cover of darkness, the slave reported. If you move your fleet to block the straits tonight, you can trap them completely. Xerxes took the bait. He ordered his entire navy to row into the narrow straits under the cover of darkness, positioning them perfectly for a dawn attack. But by entering the confined waters, the Persians had surrendered their greatest advantage, their numbers. Their ships were heavy, built for the open sea, and in the tight channel, they became a tangled, unmanageable mess. As dawn broke, the Greeks did not flee. They rowed out in a disciplined formation, and then the morning wind, a predictable daily occurrence in those waters, began to blow. This was not a storm, but a steady, choppy breeze that churned the strait into a short, sharp chop. For the lighter, more maneuverable Greek triremes, these waves were a minor nuisance. But for the tall, top-heavy Persian ships packed with extra soldiers for boarding actions, it was a disaster. The wind and waves rocked them violently, making it nearly impossible for their archers to aim and for their rowers to maintain a steady stroke. The Persian formation, already congested, descended into chaos. The Greek triremes, built like daggers, darted through the disordered mass. They used their bronze-tipped rams to punch holes in the Persian hulls, shearing off oars and then backing away before the enemy could grapple them. The Greeks were not just fighting the Persian navy, they were fighting the weather itself, and the weather was their steadfast ally. Ship after Persian ship was rammed, boarded, or simply capsized in the turbulent water. The sea grew thick with wreckage and the desperate struggles of thousands of men. By afternoon, the Persian fleet was shattered, its remnants fleeing in panic. The victory at Salamis was absolute. It saved Athens from certain destruction and secured the survival of the very ideas of democracy and Greek culture that would form the bedrock of Western civilization. The wind that morning did not just fill the sails of the Greek ships, it carried the future of an entire world upon its back. Even the most decisive battlefield victory can be washed away by the tides of change. At the Battle of Muhlberg in 1547, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V scored what appeared to be a final, crushing triumph over his Protestant enemies. His imperial forces routed the army of the Schmalkaldic League, a powerful alliance of German princes who had dared to defy his Catholic authority. The League was shattered, its military power broken. The most significant prize was the capture of its leader, Elector John Frederick I of Saxony. As the defeated prince, wounded and humiliated, was led away as a prisoner, the skies over Germany seemed to mirror the moment. A sudden, heavy downpour began to fall, drenching the victorious soldiers and the captive elector alike. To the emperor and his followers, this rain might have felt like a celestial cleansing, a blessing washing the stain of rebellion from the land. They had won the day, and the future of Catholicism in the empire seemed assured. But this rain was not an end. It was a profound metaphor. Just as this single storm could not permanently erase the landscape, the imperial victory could not wash away the deep-rooted ideas of the Protestant Reformation. The rain, after all, does not destroy the seeds in the soil, it helps them to grow and spread. Though John Frederick lost his freedom and much of his territory, the very public nature of his dignified suffering in the face of defeat only strengthened the Protestant cause, turning him into a martyr. The political and religious resistance scattered by the battle simply went underground, flowing like water into new channels. The emperor's triumph at Muhlberg proved to be a hollow one. He had captured a prince, but he could not capture the hearts and minds of thousands who now clung to the new faith. Within a few years, the Protestant princes regrouped, forcing Charles V to agree to the Peace of Augsburg, a treaty that legally granted Lutheranism the right to exist within the empire. The rain that fell that day symbolized not a final purification, but the relentless spreading nature of an idea whose time had come, an idea that no army and no weather could ultimately hold back. That same bitter cold that shattered Napoleon's army had its American counterpart on a famously brutal Christmas night. While the Hessian mercenaries in Trenton warmed themselves with holiday wine, George Washington's Continental Army was marching into a living ice storm. A fierce nor'easter raged, pelting the 6,000 underfed and poorly clothed soldiers with a miserable mix of freezing rain, sleet, and heavy snow. The wind did not just bite, it seemed to gnaw at their bones, and the already treacherous roads turned into ribbons of slick, frozen mud. Their destination was the Delaware River, a wide, dark expanse now choked with jagged chunks of ice that flowed swiftly in the current. The act of crossing itself was a trial of sheer human endurance. The men crowded into sturdy, wide-bottomed Durham boats, standing shoulder to shoulder to avoid sitting on the freezing, wet planks. As they pushed off, the wind-driven ice slammed against the hulls with loud, terrifying cracks. The oarsmen, their hands numb and raw, struggled to navigate the frozen obstacle course in the pitch black, their progress agonizingly slow. Icy water sprayed over the sides, instantly freezing on their threadbare coats, coating the soldiers in a brittle, cold shell. Many of them left bloody footprints on the ice when they finally disembarked, their shoes having long since disintegrated during the march. Yet this very misery was the cloak that made their surprise possible. The Hessian commander, Colonel Johann Röhl, had received vague warnings of a possible attack. But as he looked out at the blinding, howling storm, he dismissed the idea as pure insanity. What general in his right mind would attempt a river crossing and a 9-mile march in such impossible conditions? Confident that the weather was his greatest ally, he allowed his garrison to relax their vigilance, their patrols reduced and their defenses assumed to be secure. He could not conceive that his enemy was using the storm itself as a weapon. The attack at dawn was as shocking as it was complete. The Hessians, many still groggy from their celebrations, were caught completely unprepared. They scrambled to form ranks in the streets, but the American forces, fueled by a desperate hope, quickly surrounded them. The battle was short, fierce, and overwhelmingly one-sided. In under an hour, Washington's army had captured nearly 900 Hessian soldiers with minimal losses of their own. The victory was far more than a tactical win, it was a psychological resurrection. After a long string of humiliating defeats and retreats, the Continental Army had finally won. The success at Trenton, forged in the heart of a winter gale, single-handedly revived the moribund spirit of the Revolution. It convinced weary soldiers to re-enlist, it drew new recruits to the cause, and it proved to a skeptical world that the fight for American independence was far from over. The same storm that nearly broke them on the march had become the essential element of their triumph, a stark reminder that the most dangerous weather can sometimes be a revolution's best friend. The sky itself seemed to vanish for a year and a half. Beginning in the year 535, a bizarre and terrifying gloom fell across the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and parts of Asia. The sun shone with only a dim, bluish light, as if seen through a heavy veil, and it gave no warmth. Summer never truly arrived, and frosts whitened the fields in the midst of July. Snow was reported in China during the height of summer, and crops failed from Ireland to Mesopotamia. This was not a simple drought or a bad season. It was a global climate catastrophe, a volcanic winter triggered by at least one, and possibly two, colossal volcanic eruptions, one of which was likely the progenitor of the Krakatoa we know today. These explosions were so immense they hurled cubic miles of ash and sulfurous gases high into the stratosphere, creating a reflective shield that encircled the entire planet and blocked a significant portion of the sun's life-giving energy. For 18 agonizing months, the world lived under this pall of dust. The result was universal famine, mass migrations of desperate peoples, and the complete collapse of empires like the Persian Sassanids. But in the midst of this global despair on the arid Arabian Peninsula, the very fabric of society was being stressed to its breaking point, creating a vacuum that faith would soon fill. The Arabian tribes, whose survival was already precarious, were pushed to the brink. The trade routes that sustained their economies faltered as the wider world descended into chaos. Famine and disease stalked the land, and the old tribal loyalties and pagan gods seemed powerless to stop the suffering. This period of prolonged, inexplicable darkness and cold created a profound spiritual and existential crisis. When the natural world itself appears to be dying, people begin to question everything. The old ways had failed, and a deep, collective yearning for a new, unifying truth began to emerge from the darkness. It was into this world of shattered certainties and desperate hope that the Prophet Muhammad was born in the city of Mecca around the year 570. His formative years were shaped by the stories and the lingering trauma of that generation-long crisis, a time when the world had seemingly ended. The message he would later bring, one of absolute monotheism, social justice, and the unity of all believers, offered a powerful and cohesive answer to the chaos that the volcanic winter had wrought. It replaced the fractured tribal identities with a single, powerful community, the Ummah. The cataclysm of 535 did not cause the rise of Islam, but it meticulously prepared the ground, breaking apart the old spiritual and social landscape and making a population profoundly ready for a message of renewal, submission, and a single, all-powerful God who controlled even the sun and the dust that dimmed it. The year 1780 brought a different kind of storm to the Caribbean, one that struck with such violence it seemed to tear a hole in the world itself. They called it the Great Hurricane, and when it made landfall on Barbados on the 10th of October, it erased the island's landscape in a matter of hours. Wind speeds were estimated to be so colossal that they stripped the bark from trees, leaving the island's lush vegetation a field of bare, white spears. Stone buildings were pulverized into gravel, and every single dwelling on the island was destroyed. The storm surge washed over entire towns, sweeping away people, animals, and the very foundations of the plantations that were the engine of the island's wealth. The death toll was staggering, with estimates reaching over 20,000 souls lost across the Caribbean. This was not merely a storm, it was a biblical-scale eradication of a society built on sugar and human bondage. The true historical shockwave, however, rippled out from the shattered sugar mills and flooded fields. Barbados was the jewel in the crown of the British Sugar Empire, and its plantations were not just farms, they were complex, brutal industrial systems. The hurricane annihilated this infrastructure. The windmills used to crush cane were splinters, the boiling houses and curing factories were rubble. The roads and ports needed to export the finished product were obliterated. In a single day, the economic logic of the entire region was thrown into chaos. With no means to process or ship sugar, the market for the enslaved laborers who powered that system collapsed just as completely. The relentless, brutal cycle of the Atlantic slave trade, which depended on a constant inflow of new captives to replace those worked to death, was forced into a sudden, jarring halt. This catastrophic pause had profound and unexpected consequences. In the financial centers of London and Bristol, the news of the devastation caused a cascade of insurance failures and bankruptcies. Merchants who had financed the sugar trade saw their investments literally washed away. For the first time, the immense financial risk of relying on a system so vulnerable to nature's whims became starkly apparent. The disaster forced a restructuring of the entire colonial economy, but it also did something more. It gave ammunition to a growing moral and economic argument. A small but vocal abolitionist movement seized upon the hurricane as proof. They argued that the slave system was not only a moral abomination, but it was also a fundamentally unstable and unsustainable enterprise, vulnerable to being wiped out in a single night by a force beyond any human control. The Great Hurricane of 1780 did not end the slave trade, but it delivered a blow from which the system never fully recovered, accelerating the economic and ethical debates that would, within a few decades, lead to its abolition. A storm's fury had shaken the foundations of one of history's greatest crimes. London was supposed to crown a king, but the heavens delivered a blizzard instead. After his victory at Hastings, William the Conqueror had finally secured the English throne, and his coronation at Westminster Abbey on Christmas Day in 1066 was meant to be the ultimate symbol of a new, orderly Norman rule. The ceremony was meticulously planned to legitimize his contested claim before both his new Anglo-Saxon subjects and his own Norman nobles. Yet as the dignitaries gathered, a sudden and violent snowstorm descended upon the city without warning. This was not a gentle dusting, but a furious, blinding whiteout that paralyzed London, making travel nearly impossible and delaying the crucial ceremony. That forced pause in the bitter cold was a pressure cooker for fear. Inside the abbey, the air was thick with political tension, but outside, the Norman guards stationed around the building grew increasingly anxious. Isolated in the swirling snow, they began to imagine a revolt brewing in the unseen city. Every shadow in the storm seemed to hide an Anglo-Saxon assassin. Their fear curdled into panic, and in a catastrophic misjudgment, they decided to take preemptive action. They began setting fire to the surrounding buildings, hoping the flames would drive out any potential attackers and secure the perimeter. But the fire, whipped by the same winds that brought the snow, quickly spread out of control. Thick, black smoke began to pour into the abbey, stinging the eyes of everyone inside and choking the solemn hymns. The coronation service continued, but it was now shrouded in a literal and figurative darkness. The congregation, believing the smoke was a sign of a full-scale uprising, broke into a terrified frenzy. People screamed and rushed for the doors, while William himself, standing at the altar, was left trembling, unsure if his crown was being placed upon his head at the very moment his reign was being consumed by flames. This disastrous start cast a long and indelible shadow. The immediate resentment was profound. The Anglo-Saxons saw the fires as a deliberate act of Norman barbarism, a wanton attack on their city disguised as security. For William, the coronation that was meant to unite a kingdom had instead exposed its deep fractures and sown the seeds of immediate rebellion. The mistrust and unrest born in that smoky abbey on a snowy Christmas day would plague his rule for years to come, proving that even a king who conquered an army could be undone by a single storm's power to ignite panic. That same pattern of drought and displacement would replay itself with devastating modern consequences. In the first decade of the 21st century, a severe and unrelenting drought settled over Syria, a dry spell that would last for 5 long years. This was not merely a bad season for farmers, it was a systemic collapse of the rural economy. The rains that had sustained ancient agricultural traditions for millennia simply vanished. Reservoirs and groundwater wells dried up completely, and the earth itself cracked under the relentless sun. Farmers watched their wheat and barley crops wither and die in the fields, while their herds of sheep and goats, the primary source of wealth for many families, perished from thirst and starvation. An entire way of life passed down through generations was being systematically erased. This environmental catastrophe forced approximately 1.5 million rural Syrians to make an agonizing choice: abandon their ancestral lands or face certain ruin. They packed what little they had left and migrated into the country's already overcrowded cities, like Aleppo, Homs, and the suburbs of Damascus. But these urban centers were already under immense strain, struggling to accommodate a massive influx of refugees who had fled the war in neighboring Iraq. The cities became pressure cookers. The new arrivals from the countryside found no jobs, no housing, and little help from a government that seemed indifferent to their suffering. They settled in sprawling, makeshift slums where resentment festered in the sweltering heat. The state, under the rule of Bashar al-Assad, had compounded the crisis by cutting subsidies for water and fuel, making a desperate situation unbearable for the poor. Can you picture the tinderbox, a generation of young men with no future, crammed into slums, watching their families go hungry, and blaming a corrupt and unresponsive regime for their misery? The drought did not pull a trigger, but it loaded the gun. It created the precise conditions of mass unemployment, extreme poverty, and deep-seated anger that made a popular uprising almost inevitable. When the first protests finally erupted in the spring of 2011, they were not just about political freedom, they were about bread, water, and dignity. The weather had not caused the Syrian civil war, but it had meticulously prepared the kindling, proving that even in our modern, technologically advanced world, a prolonged absence of rain can still be the spark that ignites a conflict which would reshape the global order. From the divine winds of Japan to the desperate snows of Valley Forge, we have traced the path of a silent protagonist. This journey reveals a simple, staggering truth. The forecast has often been more powerful than the king or the general. Time and again, the climate has stepped onto the stage of human affairs not as a backdrop, but as the lead actor, toppling empires with a frost, saving revolutions with a fog, and redirecting the flow of entire civilizations with a drought. It is the ultimate unpredictable variable, a force that mocks our best-laid plans and reminds us of our profound vulnerability to the world we inhabit. These 25 moments are but a fraction of a much larger story, one where the air itself holds the power to crown and to conquer. As we now navigate a new era defined by our own influence on the global climate, we are forced to confront a haunting question. What future historical shifts, what unforeseen collapses or desperate migrations are we setting in motion with the weather patterns we are creating today? The next chapter in this ancient relationship between humanity and the elements is being written right now. We would love to hear which of these weather-driven stories resonated most with you, so share your thoughts in the comments below. And for more journeys into the forces that secretly shaped our world, be sure to subscribe.